The aerial reconnaissance photographs that American intelligence officers studied during the months before Operation Galvanic showed Betio Island in Tarawa Atoll as a narrow strip of coral barely rising above the Pacific Ocean, approximately 2 miles long and never more than 800 yards wide, covered with palm trees and surrounded by a coral reef that extended hundreds of yards from the shore. What the photographs could not fully reveal was that Japanese engineers had spent more than a year transforming this tiny speck of coral into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific, a killing ground designed specifically to destroy American forces attempting amphibious assault against defenses that Rear Admiral Shibasaki, commanding the Japanese garrison, boasted could not be taken by 1,000,000 men in 100 years. Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division assigned to capture Betio as part of the American offensive into the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, understood from intelligence reports and from the reconnaissance photographs that his Marines would face formidable defenses unlike anything encountered in previous Pacific operations. The Japanese had constructed hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers and pillboxes, some with walls 5 feet thick built from steel-reinforced concrete, and coconut logs that could withstand direct hits from naval gunfire. They had positioned coastal defense guns, including 8-inch naval rifles taken from ships, numerous smaller artillery pieces, and dozens of anti-boat guns specifically designed to destroy landing craft before they could reach the beach. The defenses included a 4-foot-high seawall constructed from coral and logs running along most of the island's northern shore, where American planners expected to land the assault waves. Behind the seawall, interconnected defensive positions provided interlocking fields of fire covering every inch of the beaches and the shallow waters approaching them. The Japanese had registered their weapons on every likely approach route, had constructed underground command posts and ammunition storage bunkers connected by tunnels that would allow defenders to survive bombardment and then emerge to engage attacking forces, and had positioned machine guns and riflemen in positions calculated to maximize casualties among troops attempting to cross the beaches. The garrison defending Betio numbered approximately 4,800 men, including 2,600 elite Special Naval Landing Force troops, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, along with 2,200 construction workers and support personnel who would also fight when the assault came. These were not the poorly trained garrison troops that had defended some earlier American objectives, but experienced combat soldiers who had trained extensively for defensive operations and who were indoctrinated with the Japanese military code that demanded fighting to the death rather than surrendering under any circumstances. Every man on the island understood that he would die defending Betio and that his death would contribute to inflicting maximum casualties on the Americans. The American plan for taking Betio, designated Operation Galvanic, called for preliminary naval and air bombardment to destroy Japanese defenses before Marines landed on 3 beaches designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3 on the northern shore of the island. The bombardment would be the heaviest yet employed in support of a Pacific amphibious operation, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers firing thousands of shells into the tiny island, while carrier aircraft dropped bombs and strafed defensive positions. American planners believed, or at least hoped, that this overwhelming firepower would neutralize Japanese defenses to the point where Marines could land with minimal opposition and quickly secure the island. The critical question that American planners could not answer with certainty concerned the depth of water over the coral reef at the time when assault waves would approach the beaches. Landing craft required at least 3 to 4 feet of water to cross the reef without grounding. The tide tables predicted adequate water depth at the planned H-hour of 0830 on November 20, 1943. But local knowledge from residents of the Gilbert Islands who had been consulted suggested that unpredictable dodging tides sometimes occurred that left the reef exposed or covered by only inches of water, regardless of what tide tables predicted. If the tide was low when Marines approached, landing craft would ground on the reef hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade through chest-deep or waist-deep water under fire from Japanese positions that the bombardment had failed to neutralize. The Marines of the 2nd Division, who boarded transport ships for the voyage to Tarawa in November 1943, had trained extensively for amphibious operations, but most had never experienced combat. The division included veterans from Guadalcanal, where the 2nd Marines had fought, but many of the infantry battalions consisted largely of replacements who had joined after Guadalcanal and whose combat experience existed only through training exercises that could never fully replicate the chaos and terror of actual battle. The officers and senior NCOs who would lead these Marines understood from studying previous amphibious operations that the first waves would suffer the heaviest casualties, and that leadership would be critical to getting men off the beaches and into the Japanese defenses where the battle would be decided in close combat. The naval bombardment that began at dawn on November 20, 1943, announced the assault with a thunder that could be heard for miles across the ocean. The battleships USS Maryland, USS Colorado, and USS Tennessee, along with cruisers and destroyers, fired salvo after salvo into Betio, their heavy shells creating massive explosions that threw up columns of coral, sand, smoke, and debris. Carrier aircraft from Task Force 50 bombed and strafed the island, dropping hundreds of tons of ordnance on Japanese positions and setting fires that sent black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The bombardment continued for 3 hours, longer and heavier than any previous bombardment in support of a Pacific amphibious operation, and observers watching from the transports believed that nothing could survive such devastation. But the bombardment, while visually impressive and psychologically reassuring to the Marines preparing to assault, achieved far less actual destruction than American commanders assumed. Most shells landed in areas between Japanese defensive positions or exploded on impact against the coral surface without penetrating to underground bunkers where Japanese troops sheltered during the bombardment. The reinforced concrete bunkers that had been specifically designed to withstand naval gunfire survived with their defenders intact, ready to emerge and man their weapons once the bombardment lifted. Japanese casualties during the bombardment were minimal, perhaps a few dozen killed from the thousands of shells fired, and the defensive positions remained largely intact and fully capable of engaging the assault waves. The first 3 waves of Marines, riding in tracked LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, nicknamed amtracs, successfully crossed the reef despite water depth being less than predicted and reached the beaches beginning at approximately 0900, about 30 minutes behind schedule due to confusion during the approach and difficulties organizing the assault waves in the darkness before dawn. The amtracs climbed over the coral reef and deposited Marines on the beaches or just offshore in shallow water, then attempted to retract to bring in subsequent waves. Marines scrambled from the vehicles and ran toward the seawall, seeking whatever cover it provided, while Japanese fire from positions that the bombardment had failed to neutralize began killing men on the beach and in the water. The 4th and subsequent waves, riding in conventional Higgins boats that required deeper water than the amtracs needed, grounded on the reef approximately 500 to 700 yards from shore, exactly as some planners had feared. The Higgins boat's bow ramps dropped, and Marines stepped off into water that ranged from waist-deep to chest-deep, depending on individual height and the exact location where boats grounded. They began wading toward shore, carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment and weapons, trying to move as quickly as possible through water that resisted every step, presenting perfect targets to Japanese machine gunners and riflemen who had trained for exactly this scenario. The waiting Marines experienced a nightmare that survivors would remember with horror for the rest of their lives. Japanese machine gun fire from positions along the seawall and from pillboxes set back from the beach created interlocking fields of fire that swept the water, bullets creating splashes and hitting men who stumbled and fell and often didn't rise again. Men dropped their weapons and equipment, trying to reduce weight and move faster. Some removed helmets and flak jackets to reduce drag. Others simply froze in place, unable to move forward into the fire and unable to turn back, standing in the water until they were hit or until officers or NCOs got them moving again. The water around the reef turned red with blood from casualties that mounted with every passing minute. Marines who made it to the beach found themselves pinned against the seawall by fire from Japanese positions that covered every foot of the beach. The seawall provided some protection from direct fire, but no cover from Japanese positions that could fire down onto Marines huddled behind it. Attempts to climb over the seawall and advance inland were met with concentrated fire that killed or wounded anyone who exposed themselves. The beaches became crowded with living and dead, with wounded crying for corpsmen, with officers trying to organize attacks to break the deadlock, with Marines who had expected to be inland, securing objectives instead trapped on a narrow strip of coral trying to survive. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault force, came ashore on Red Beach 2 during the mid-morning and immediately recognized that the situation was far worse than anyone had anticipated during planning. Marines were pinned down along the entire northern shore with minimal progress inland. Casualties were mounting rapidly. Communication with units was difficult because radios damaged by water often didn't function, and Japanese defenses that should have been destroyed by the bombardment were fully operational and inflicting devastating casualties on troops exposed on the beaches or in the water. Shoup established a command post in the shelter of a Japanese bunker that Marines had captured and began trying to organize the chaos into some semblance of coordinated operations. The fighting on November 20th devolved into dozens of small unit actions as squad and platoon-sized groups of Marines attempted to attack individual Japanese positions, engaging bunkers and pillboxes at close range with grenades, flamethrowers, satchel charges, and direct fire from tanks that had come ashore in the later waves. Japanese defenders fought with desperate determination from fortified positions, requiring Marines to approach within grenade-throwing range to neutralize each position, because weapons fire alone rarely destroyed the reinforced bunkers or killed the defenders sheltering inside them. The close combat was brutal and often hand-to-hand when Marines penetrated into bunker complexes where Japanese troops waited with rifles, grenades, and sometimes swords. The casualty rate during the first day exceeded anything the Marines had previously experienced in the Pacific War. Approximately 1,500 Marines were killed or wounded on November 20th out of approximately 5,000 who had landed by nightfall, a casualty rate of 30% that would have broken less determined forces. Entire platoons and companies were reduced to a handful of effectives. Officers and NCOs died in disproportionate numbers because they led attacks and exposed themselves while trying to get their men moving. The wounded accumulated on the beaches and in the shallow water, because evacuation was impossible while Japanese fire covered the approaches, and corpsmen treating casualties were themselves frequently hit while trying to save wounded Marines. The night of November 20th to 21st was a terrible ordeal for the Marines on Betio. Japanese infiltrators probed American positions, and occasional counterattacks attempted to push Marines back into the sea. Isolated groups of Marines held small perimeters, not knowing where friendly units were located or whether they would survive until dawn. The wounded suffered without adequate medical care, some dying from wounds that would have been survivable with prompt treatment. Thirst became a serious problem because canteens emptied during the day's fighting and no fresh water was available on the island. Marines drank water contaminated with coral dust and blood, suffering from dysentery and dehydration that compounded their exhaustion. Colonel Shoup's message to division headquarters late on November 20th became famous for its understated assessment of a desperate situation. Casualties many, percentage dead not known, combat efficiency, we are winning. The message captured the determination that kept Marines fighting despite catastrophic losses and a tactical situation that appeared hopeless to anyone who saw the carnage on the beaches. Shoup's leadership during the first day, his personal courage under fire, and his ability to maintain offensive operations despite casualties that would justify withdrawing earned him the Medal of Honor and established him as one of the heroes of Tarawa. Additional forces landed during the night and on November 21st, bringing total American troop strength on Betio to approximately 8,000 Marines, despite continued Japanese fire that made landing difficult and that caused casualties among incoming troops before they ever reached the beach. The reinforcements allowed American commanders to expand the beachhead and to begin systematic reduction of Japanese positions using the tactics that had been developed during the first day's fighting. Tanks supported infantry attacks, using their main guns and machine guns to suppress Japanese positions, while Marines closed with grenades and flamethrowers. Engineers used demolitions to destroy bunkers that were too strong to be reduced by other weapons. The fighting on November 21st saw gradual American progress as Marines pushed inland from the beaches, expanding the beachhead yard by yard through continued close combat against Japanese positions that had to be individually neutralized. The Marines captured the airfield in the center of the island, though Japanese positions around the airfield continued resisting and inflicting casualties on troops attempting to use it. American control of the airfield provided a reference point for coordinating attacks and allowed supplies and ammunition to be brought forward to units that had expended their initial loads during the previous day's fighting. Japanese resistance began showing signs of disorganization and weakening on November 22nd as the cumulative effects of 3 days of combat, ammunition shortages, and casualties reduced the defenders' ability to conduct coordinated defensive operations. Marines attacking from multiple directions into the remaining Japanese-held areas found less resistance than during previous days, though individual positions continued fighting with the same determination that had characterized Japanese defense throughout the battle. By late afternoon on November 22nd, American forces controlled most of Betio except for a pocket on the eastern end of the island where several hundred Japanese troops continued resisting. The final Japanese resistance collapsed on November 23rd when a desperate nighttime counterattack by approximately 300 Japanese troops attempting to break through American lines and reach the western end of the island was stopped with heavy casualties by Marines defending prepared positions. The counterattack represented the last organized Japanese effort to influence the battle's outcome, and its failure meant that remaining Japanese troops would fight only from isolated positions without coordination or hope of achieving anything beyond inflicting a few more American casualties before being killed. Organized resistance ended on November 23rd when Marines overran the last Japanese positions, though isolated defenders continued fighting from bunkers and fortified positions until they were killed, or until they committed suicide rather than surrendering. The Battle of Tarawa officially ended on November 23, 1943, after 76 hours of combat that had killed approximately 1,000 Marines with another 2,000 wounded, casualty rates unprecedented in American military history, measured by the concentration of losses in such a small area over such a short time. Japanese casualties totaled approximately 4,700 killed, including almost the entire garrison, with only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers captured, most of them wounded and unable to continue fighting or commit suicide. The disparity between Japanese killed and captured illustrated the effectiveness of Japanese indoctrination about fighting to death and the near-total unwillingness of Japanese troops to surrender even when their situation was hopeless. The strategic significance of Tarawa was limited compared to the casualties suffered capturing it. The island provided an airfield for supporting subsequent operations in the Marshall Islands, but this could have been achieved by capturing other islands in the Gilberts with less formidable defenses. The primary value of Tarawa lay in the lessons learned about amphibious operations against heavily fortified positions, lessons purchased with the blood of Marines who died learning what worked and what didn't when assaulting defended coral atolls. These lessons would save lives during subsequent operations at Kwajalein, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa by informing planning and tactics for those assaults. The most critical lesson from Tarawa concerned the inadequacy of pre-assault bombardment that looked devastating, but achieved minimal actual destruction of hardened defenses. Future operations would employ longer bombardments with more careful targeting of specific defensive positions, closer coordination between naval gunfire and airstrikes, and systematic assessment of bombardment effectiveness, rather than assuming that impressive explosions meant defenses were destroyed. The development of underwater demolition teams to reconnoiter beaches and clear obstacles before assault waves landed emerged directly from Tarawa's experience of Marines wading through water under fire. The problems with communication during the battle led to improved radio equipment that could function after immersion in salt water, and to better procedures for maintaining communication between assault forces and supporting ships. The difficulties coordinating naval gunfire support during the battle produced new procedures for controlling supporting fires and for adjusting fire missions based on feedback from forward observers ashore. The terrible casualties suffered by Marines wading ashore from grounded landing craft led to increased production of amtracs and to tactics emphasizing their use in initial assault waves. The casualty evacuation problems experienced at Tarawa, where wounded Marines lay on beaches or in the water for hours before they could be evacuated because Japanese fire prevented boats from approaching, led to improved casualty handling procedures, including designation of specific beaches for evacuation, improved coordination with medical ships offshore, and pre-positioning of medical supplies on beaches where casualties were expected. The thirst that Marines suffered because canteens were emptied during fighting and no fresh water was available led to better procedures for bringing water ashore and for establishing water distribution points in assault areas. The public reaction to Tarawa in the United States was shock and anger at the casualties suffered capturing what appeared on maps as an insignificant speck of coral. Time and Life magazines published graphic photographs of dead Marines lying on the beaches, images that brought home the reality of amphibious warfare in ways that previous sanitized reporting had not. The photographs generated intense debate about whether the island was worth the casualties, whether the assault should have been attempted at all, and whether military commanders were spending American lives carelessly. The controversy forced military leaders to justify the operation and to explain that the lessons learned would save lives in future operations. The Marine Corps faced particular criticism because Tarawa was a Marine operation commanded by Marine officers and conducted by Marine infantry, and casualties appeared to result from inadequate planning and from tactical decisions that exposed troops to unnecessary risks. The criticism was largely unfair because the problems at Tarawa resulted from factors that planning could not fully address, including the unpredictable tide, the resilience of Japanese fortifications against naval bombardment, and the fanatical determination of Japanese defenders to fight to death. But the criticism forced the Marine Corps to carefully examine what had gone wrong and to implement improvements that would characterize subsequent operations. Colonel Shoup and other officers who had commanded during the battle spent considerable time after Tarawa studying what had happened, identifying mistakes that had been made, and developing recommendations for future operations. These after-action assessments were brutally honest about failures and problems, reflecting the Marine Corps culture that emphasized learning from mistakes rather than covering them up or assigning blame. The willingness to conduct critical self-assessment contributed significantly to the improvements that made subsequent amphibious operations more successful and less costly, despite the defenders being just as determined and the fortifications being equally formidable. The psychological impact on survivors who had fought at Tarawa was profound and long-lasting. Marines who had experienced the waiting under fire, who had seen friends killed beside them, who had participated in the close combat that characterized the fighting once forces got off the beaches, carried trauma that would affect them for decades. The intensity of combat concentrated into 76 hours exceeded what most men could process psychologically, and the casualty rates meant that few emerged without having witnessed deaths of men they knew personally. Post-traumatic stress was not understood or treated effectively in 1943, and men simply had to cope with their experiences as best they could. The veterans of Tarawa developed fierce pride in having survived one of the most difficult battles in Marine Corps history, pride that compensated to some degree for the trauma they carried. The battle became legendary within the Marine Corps as the ultimate test of courage and determination, the operation that proved Marines could assault and capture any objective, regardless of defenses or casualties. The 2nd Marine Division's unofficial motto, "Follow Me," reflected the aggressive leadership that had characterized the battle and that had gotten Marines off the beaches and into the Japanese defenses despite catastrophic fire. The comparison between Tarawa and subsequent operations demonstrated how effectively the lessons were learned and applied. The assault on Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands in February 1944 employed much longer and more systematic pre-assault bombardment, better coordination between naval gunfire and airstrikes, improved tactics for getting troops ashore, and better casualty evacuation procedures. Casualties at Kwajalein were significantly lower despite the defenders being just as determined, validating the improvements that had been implemented based on Tarawa experience. The assault on Saipan in June 1944 faced similar challenges to Tarawa, including heavily fortified beaches and determined Japanese defenders, but improved amphibious tactics and more effective pre-assault bombardment resulted in successful assault despite the island being much larger and the garrison being far stronger than at Tarawa. The Marines who landed at Saipan included veterans of Tarawa who understood from experience what worked and what didn't, and their knowledge informed tactical decisions at small unit level in ways that training alone could never have provided. Iwo Jima in February 1945 represented the culmination of amphibious doctrine development that began at Tarawa. The assault employed massive pre-invasion bombardment, including 3 days of continuous naval gunfire, extensive use of amtracs to get troops ashore quickly, systematic reduction of fortified positions using tactics developed through 2 years of experience, and sophisticated coordination between ground forces, naval gunfire, and air support. Casualties at Iwo Jima were heavy because the defenses were extraordinarily strong, and the island was larger than Betio, but the assault succeeded, and American forces captured the island, despite facing possibly the most formidable defenses encountered in any Pacific operation. The Japanese analysis of Tarawa reached conclusions that would influence their defensive planning for subsequent operations. Japanese commanders recognized that beach defenses, no matter how strong, could be overcome by American firepower and determination if Marines could get ashore and begin systematic reduction of fortifications. Future Japanese defensive plans emphasized defense in depth with main defensive positions inland rather than concentrated on beaches, a shift in doctrine that made American assaults more difficult by extending the area that had to be captured and by preventing single overwhelming attacks from deciding battles quickly. The fortifications at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa reflected lessons that Japanese commanders learned from Tarawa about what defensive tactics were most effective against American amphibious assaults. Rather than concentrating forces at the beaches where American naval gunfire and air support could destroy them, Japanese defenders would allow American forces to land with minimal opposition and then engage them in defense in depth using interconnected positions that had to be reduced individually through close combat. The new tactics prolonged battles and increased American casualties, even though they could not prevent eventual American victory, given overwhelming American advantages in firepower and logistics. The Battle of Tarawa fundamentally changed American understanding of what amphibious operations against fortified positions required and what costs they would entail. The pre-Tarawa optimism that overwhelming firepower could neutralize defenses before troops landed had been proven false by the experience of Marines pinned down on beaches under fire from positions that naval bombardment had failed to destroy. Future planning would be based on realistic assessment of what bombardment could achieve and what it couldn't, leading to more careful preparation and to tactics designed to succeed despite strong defenses remaining operational when assault waves landed. The courage and sacrifice of the Marines who fought at Tarawa achieved an objective that strategically was of limited value, but that operationally was essential for perfecting the amphibious doctrine that would enable subsequent operations across the Pacific. The men who died on the beaches or in the water approaching them, the wounded who suffered for hours before they could be evacuated, the survivors who carried psychological wounds that never fully healed, all contributed to developing the tactics and procedures that would characterize American amphibious operations through the remainder of the war and beyond into the post-war period when amphibious capability became a defining characteristic of American military power. The tiny island of Betio that cost so much to capture in November 1943 today appears much as it did during the battle, the coral beaches and palm trees looking peaceful despite the violence that occurred there. The bunkers and defensive positions constructed by Japanese engineers remain visible, overgrown with vegetation, but still recognizable as the fortifications that withstood naval bombardment and that required close combat to neutralize. The American cemetery on Betio contains graves of Marines who died during the battle and whose remains were never recovered for return to the United States, a permanent reminder of the cost of victory. The annual commemorations held at Tarawa bring together the dwindling number of veterans who fought there, along with family members of men who died, historians studying the battle, and officials from the United States and Kiribati, the modern nation that includes Tarawa Atoll. The ceremonies honor the sacrifice of those who died while acknowledging the historical significance of the battle in developing amphibious warfare doctrine. The veterans who attend, now in their 90s or older, share memories of the battle and find some comfort in being with others who shared their experience and who understand what they went through. The battle remains controversial among military historians and in popular understanding, with debate continuing about whether the casualties were necessary, whether the island should have been bypassed in favor of less heavily defended objectives, and whether the lessons learned justified the blood price paid. The debate reflects fundamental questions about military decision-making and about how to balance the value of objectives against the costs of capturing them. No consensus exists, and probably never will, about whether Tarawa was worth the casualties. But there is general agreement that the Marines who fought there displayed courage and determination that exemplifies the finest traditions of American military service. The 76 hours of combat on Betio Island in November 1943 demonstrated both the terrible costs of amphibious operations against fortified positions and the determination of American forces to overcome any obstacle through systematic application of firepower and through the individual courage of men willing to advance into fire because their training, their leadership, and their commitment to each other demanded it. The battle proved that heavily fortified coral atolls could be captured despite determined Japanese defense and despite earlier Japanese boasts that such positions were impregnable. But the proof came at terrible cost in American lives and in the suffering of those who survived carrying physical and psychological wounds that never fully healed.